So I had like three different titles I was going to go with today because there's a lot of kinds of issues in central Alabama with historic preservation and the nature of legacy data. So the environmental impacts today were never the main focus of a research program that I had started a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And it was more so to answer some pretty basic questions for landowners I was working with, but also for historic preservation forum that I was doing a lot of work with in Birmingham, Alabama. So you'll see a little bit of a mixture here today as I kind of introduce what the overall issues are and, how kind of went around some of these. So to kind of give a brief outline, I'm going to talk about some of the environmental issues in central Alabama, specifically with their impacts on historic preservation. And then I'll kind of shift gears to talking about river erosion and cultural landscapes, specifically to the Mississippian cultural landscape and the early historic cultural landscape of the Black Warrior River Valley, which is where many know is Moundville and a lot of other really great historic sites. This is where when Alabama first became a state, one of the capitals were. And then I'll shift gears to specifically Snow's Bend Farm, which is a site that I have been working at. And just when we end the PowerPoint here, I can always talk about the geophysics, but one of the things I wanted to kind of guide our discussion was to talking about ways in which we can work with local stakeholders to provide tools and methods for them to kind of evaluate their localized impacts, because as will come clear, things will vary site to site, even along the same river path within a short distance. So to start off with talking about some of the environmental issues, I have this picture here of a stock tunnel from Sloss Furnace's National Historic Landmark, where I was an archaeologist there for a little while, about 2 years. And at this stock tunnel right here, this is about 30 feet underground. And what this was is it was built in 1910 to kind of facilitate the movement and measurement of a lot of different goods as it goes into a blast furnace to produce a lot of the iron in the Southeast. And this stock tunnel, I always use this photo because you can see quite a few things here. It's pretty wet. And when you look at the walls, you can also kind of see the lines where it's kind of flooded at the stock tunnels. So this is pretty deep underground, but it also goes a little deeper underground. And over time, over the past 100 or so years, this stock tunnel floods quite frequently, and sometimes you can find some funny stuff floating up. When I would lead tours down there, one of our tour guides had dropped his microphone and it floated up one day about like 2 months later. So with the stock tunnels, this floods and this impacts a lot of the underground infrastructure of Sloss furnaces, and it's a pretty big barrier to preservation. So with the water issues is pretty much the common through line here. And in central Alabama, with the water, you have issues such as environmental pollution from both historic and contemporary, furnaces and mills. But you also have increasing severe storms. So, we think about tornadoes and hurricanes and, a lot of these big kinds of issues. The tornadoes are quite a particular problem here, especially in more of the historic preservation realm when we're dealing with above ground architecture. So, houses are getting destroyed. And then April 27th, 2011, there was over 400 lives lost from a tract of tornadoes that ran through central Alabama. And with the increasing severe storms beyond just it affecting the built environment, this also, water from some particularly wet hurricanes and severe storms and the frequent flash flooding in the area starts to accumulate and create a lot of erosion issues within sites that have kind of poor drainage like this, but also along the river. So you have the Cahaba and the Black Warrior, everything that kind of filters down through Mobile. And then the other thing I kind of want to point out here too is some of the landscape modifications. So this gets pretty related to the environmental pollution because a lot of it is legacies from mining in the area for the past 150, 40 years. So a lot of these kinds of issues all kind of work in hand with each other, but the problem that becomes particularly prevalent when you start dealing with historic preservation in the area is that it's really hard to evaluate these impacts because people who are going into these aren't necessarily given the correct tools to kind of evaluate these impacts. to their sites, and they're kind of having to be reactionary rather than proactive when dealing with preservation issues in the state. And that's going to be a pretty common issue for a lot of us all over the place. But when you start thinking about some of the rich heritage that is in Central Alabama, not just the indigenous heritage, but also the heritage of dealing with civil rights, it's a little bit been a little bit of an issue. So I put a few sites off to the right just so you can kind of think about what's going on in this Central Alabama area over time and across space. We have the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, Red Mountain Park, which is really like a collection of lots and lots and lots of mining sites and mining camps and mining towns. And then you have Mountville Archaeological Park, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But then you start having some stuff like demolished sites, like the Tuggle School, which was a school for orphan children in Central Alabama that from the late 1800s. And that was demolished during the construction of I-65. Then you have the Sloss Quarters, which are worker housing for Sloss furnaces, destroyed in 1955. And then you have Bessemer Mounds, which were destroyed, through excavation. And now there is a water park on top of it. And it's just talked about because Bessemer Mounds were there, and there's a sign there that says they were there, but it's a little bit of it's one of those issues that just kind of keep coming through and through. So I have this picture here too, because I talked about the flooding with Sloss. This is a one of the hoist house for the Ensley blast furnaces outside of Birmingham. And this is above ground. And I just wanted to get you guys to have an understanding of kind of like how these impacts are, with water are affecting the interiors of some of these buildings too. This building's been flooded for a long time. Now it's demolished. So, the entire site was demolished, the smokestacks and everything. And, a lot of this is what a lot of what you're seeing here is what the state of a lot of these buildings are. Obviously, this isn't like the most attractive looking building that was there. I mean, you have some beautiful buildings that had these nice marble tiles and all kinds of stuff that could have been repurposed over time. But this is kind of the state of where things were left because they didn't have the resources. So I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit because I've talked a lot about water. So I want to talk about river erosion, specifically dealing with cultural landscape in the Black Warrior Valley. So the Black Warrior Valley is famous due to big Mississippian chiefdom. You have Moundville there. You have a lot of other important archaeological sites there, especially dealing with the city of Tuscaloosa and Northport. The city of Tuscaloosa was the capital of Alabama at one point. We don't really talk about the archaeology of the city very much, but it's pretty interesting. And it was where the first women's college was in the state, and one of the biggest state houses too. So there's a lot of interesting kinds of cultural heritage in the river, in the valley. So here at the river, the erosion has been an issue because there's parts of the river that are sinuous. It's just continuing, the water is just continuing along a straight path, and then it meanders in quite a few different places. And that meandering over it, some of the sites have been protected by natural bluffs, but with the increased precipitation in the area, the swelling of the rivers, the preservation of these sites has been kind of particularly at risk as these channels start to shift. So at Moundville, beginning in 91, the Corps of Engineers had started to kind of focus on erosion at the riverbank. And then it just continued to get worse and worse over time. So back around 2015 to 2017, I don't remember exactly when, they had started talking with the Corps of Engineers, and started talking about a stabilization project for the bank. So some people at the University of Alabama and the Office of Archaeological Research were working pretty hard to help kind of get that prepared as they were trying to figure out a way to preserve this, because this area of Moundville that was being eroded right at the river, this is a particularly high kind of cliff for those of you who have been there. It's kind of a big bluff overlooking the river, and it's hard to do work there because of that. But also it's an area of the site that's largely underexplored and was, occupied later during the very late Moundville years and early historic period. So this is an important area, especially for thinking about kind of indigenous lifeways in the Black Warrior Valley. So, Moundville is a particular salient example, but I kind of want to talk about some of what the broader issues are for nearby sites. So there's a site south of Moundville that's related to the chiefdom called Minter's Creek, which hasn't ever really been subject of any kinds of archaeological excavations. And Minter's Creek is this large tiered mound, so it has a nice tier on its western half, and then it's in this area that's kind of naturally protected. But as you can kind of see in this 1960 image off to the left, the river swells. The woods are they're pretty flooded, so it's a kind of an issue here. So the only they know that the mound is there because of some auger tests that they did, but there's nothing really there. And this is one of those mounds that when they had done the auger test, they started finding a lot of these early historic kinds of proto-historic ceramic types that are really important for kind of thinking about these transitions and settlement across the valley, particularly after the DeSoto Entrada, and in this like kind of period before Alabama was a state, and the indigenous communities were still living in the area, pretty uninterrupted. So with Minter's Creek, this is kind of what it looks like today. So you have the mound right around here, and you can see that with the continued flooding over the years, it has just kind of created these deep little, ponds and streams and stuff that continue just to swell over time. And I pull up this LiDAR image just to kind of show you right here. This is where the mound is, and you can kind of see where it is in space and time. The tier is pretty prominent right there. And, that's kind of one of the things I want to point out here is that it's situated in a little bit of a weird place. Usually when you're dealing with the erosion at these sites, they're over here by the river, but with Minter's Creek, it's over here inside of the creek, something that you kind of see more so elsewhere in the Southeast that I know a lot of us who work on these kinds of sites deal with. So I kind of want to shift now to Snow's Bend. So Minter's Creek is really far south of Moundville, and Snow's Bend is the northernmost mound related to the Moundville chiefdom. So this is a site that was, it was occupied for quite a long time. So you have a lot of land tenure going from the late terminal woodland period to throughout the Mississippian period. Snow's Bend, though, the mound was one of these sites that had emerged, particularly during a unique period of regional reorganization. So around 1300s, people began leaving Moundville's multi-mound ceremonial center and moving throughout the valley and creating these new mound centers where they were supporting, new villages and just different ways of life. So some people kind of interpret that as like symbolic distancing, and that's not really what I'm engaging with here. But with Snow's Bend, this is a site, I just want to, point out, this is a site that emerged through, that, really interesting period of regional reorganization here. So 1300s to about 1520, so late Moundville 2 to Moundville 3 period here. It's been subject to a little bit of archaeological investigation. So this is kind of where some of the legacy data issues really come into play for me. And I have this picture off to the right here to show you where these previous investigations have taken place. As you can kind of see, the cemetery doesn't have a boundary, and that is one of the big issues I'll talk about here in a second in trying to relocate parts of the site. So with Snow's Bend, the environmental issues that kind of come to fruition here, you can ignore the little like black outline. That's a survey area that I'll talk about in a second. But if you look off to the picture on the left, you can kind of see how the river has changed over time. So 1938, now to now, and that's about 2.4 hectares of area just right here that has been lost, and that's about a 40 to 60 foot tall bluff overlooking the river. So as the river has kind of swelled over time, generally what you start thinking of when you start thinking of how the channels are affecting the erosion of the bluff, you start, you usually have a deeper area, and then that's where it's just chipping away at the bluff. Here, it's not really that deep when it's, the river's at its normal height, but as it floods, it's just chipping away and just destroying parts of the site. And, that's an issue because that's where a pretty large cemetery was. So another part of Snow's Bend right here, just to kind of give you a better sense of how the river is kind of affecting this overall area, is that's a lot of land lost right there. I believe what I calculated, it was somewhere around 50 hectares of surface area. That could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was around 50 hectares of surface area that's been completely lost right there. So when you start thinking about some of the issues that are going on, when we start talking about like locating these sites and trying to do some mitigation so that we can, kind of lessen the impacts that it has on preserving our cultural heritage, it's important to be able to relocate these sites. And when you start having issues like this and using geographic markers such as a single sycamore tree or 60 foot from the river, it's a little bit problematic. So, just to kind of give you a sense of just how bad the flooding gets at Snow's Bend, it's a pretty seasonal thing that happens. So in the spring, it's particularly bad around March. And you can kind of see here that the entire peninsula is almost covered underwater. So the mound in the village area that I'll talk about here is right here. But this entire area is just completely covered underwater, and that mud will sit as mud for a long, long, long time. I've gotten my truck and I've gotten the university's van stuck in it quite a few times. So this is also one of the things I want to point out about Snow's Bend here, particularly with the flooding, is that Snow's Bend is a community supported agriculture farm. So, co-op here, and when it floods like this, that can affect the crops too. So it's affecting not just cultural heritage, it affects food and stuff. And a lot of the flooding has become particularly prominent when they built a lock nearby, which was supposed to help in the 1930s and 40s, but has not really done much to help here. So close to where the cemetery is, this is kind of where it looked like in 1932 during the original investigations versus 2021. And the difference isn't really that prominent right there, but I will say that I'm standing on about a 60-foot tall, bluff when I took the photo on the left versus on the right, which is a much more gradual slope. And in the few site photos there are from those excavations, that seems to be a pretty consistent kind of gradual slope there versus what it is now. So let's see, the cemetery I've talked about here a few times. It was excavated in 1930, 1932 by some archaeologists from the Alabama Museum of Natural History. The records for these excavations were sitting in an office, and it's a little unclear where a lot of them are. Luckily, there was a single article that was published on a lot of this data, and that is the extent of what we know about where the cemetery is. And so thinking about a lot of that loss over by the river and how they're kind of situating this to where it is in regards to the rest of the site. I'm sorry, my dogs are barking in the background. The site that you're seeing right here is probably likely almost fully eroded into the river at this point. So, this cemetery, just kind of contextualize it, this is one of the two cemeteries that are outside of Moundville that are related to the Moundville chiefdom. So, when people had left Moundville, they kept returning and kind of reconfigured these former communal spaces where they were living into these little cemeteries. There's a lot of different ways in which people have interpreted that kind of reuse of space, despite this argument for symbolic distancing. But one of the things that are really interesting here is that with Snow's Bend, this is one of the two sites where we actually have like a known cemetery outside of Moundville that is related to that period of reorganization. So, with the cemetery, it is predominantly indigenous material culture that we're finding here, indigenous bodies. The material culture that you've seen here, a lot of what they had talked about when they had done the original identification of these things, they were kind of pointing out that the ways in which these burials were interred is very different than the rest of Moundville. I mean, some of the younger adults and toddler remains had a lot of items of personal adornment versus the rest, which did not. And then within here, the historic material culture, which is found over in this area, was really kind of a single barrel for a gun. It is nothing that would have been related to the DeSoto Entrada or any of the other kinds of interesting arguments that have been kind of put forth for Snow's Bend as a historic indigenous site. It is a 19th century octagonal stock pistol barrel that has some nice filigree on the side of it. You can date them by the percussion instrument. But with the cemetery too, this is a pretty important site to where how people are finding the rest of the sites for Snow's Bend. So, in 1979, they had conducted a survey after relocating the cemetery, and they conducted this nice survey at the village area to get a better sense of what's going on at Snow's Bend. What is what is the bigger picture here? I mean, it's not just a cemetery. They had found the mound during 1930, but they never really did anything with the mound. So in 1979, during the Black Warrior Survey, they had surveyed a lot of sites here. And one of the common themes that they found while they were moving throughout the river was that, the erosion on the river is causing quite a bit of issues for a lot of these sites. So there's a bias that's coming through in how the legacy data is being presented. There's a bias coming through, and just how they're able to conduct archaeology, because a lot of the sites that are really like right on the river bluff were these late terminal riverine nucleated villages, and versus the Mississippian ones, which are a little bit smaller sometimes much bigger, but they kind of shift over space just because there's just a lot of people living there. And so in 1979 they conducted the survey. So you have a lot of grog tempered ceramics, which is this woodland ceramics that we're talking about, which they all date predominantly to the late terminal woodland around 1000 AD here. And then you have shell tempered ceramics, which, you think shell tempered, you think Mississippian here. And then with the shell tempered ceramics, the pretty diagnostic designs there are the ones from the Moundville 3 period. So, pretty nice tight date range there. And then you have these nice concentrations of daub. And so why the daub is pretty significant, it is for a lot of reasons. So for some of my more theoretical kinds of approach to my work at Snow's Bend, when I was talking a lot about placemaking, daub is an architectural clay. For those of you who are not familiar with that kinds of material, it's an architectural clay. And then for Moundville, that's an architectural clay that only really appears during the Mississippian period. And it's appearing in pretty large quantities at Snow's Bend in these really tight clusters. So, large quantities of daub is pretty common for later Moundville structures. And then, the daub itself is pretty significant for Mississippian occupation. So, in terms of the work that I was doing for the more, like dealing with placemaking, this is pretty great because I can use geophysics and I can see, there's at least 3 houses probably right there. Maybe there's more. But in terms of also just kind of getting a better sense of like what is going on at Snow's Bend, especially through the legacy data, this gives a better sense of it's a lot more than just a cemetery. The cemetery is super significant, but there's also this great village here too. And so one of the other things with the legacy data from this survey is the radiocarbon date that was taken from when they had excavated a mound. So I'll talk about the mound briefly, with some of the geophysics, but during the 1979 survey, they had taken a radiocarbon date from the mound summit. And it was a little unclear what the material was. I mean, charcoal, that can be pretty ambiguous. Is it charcoal from Moundville? Is it charcoal from like part of a collapsed structure? It wasn't super clear. It kind of came into view a little bit more when I finally figured out what the lab number was for it, because when it was talked about originally, it never had a lab number. And then you had to go digging through some books to figure it out. So I found the lab number and I reached out to Beta Analytic and they were like, yeah, so that record was stored in a storage unit that was flooded during a hurricane in Miami. So we have no record of that anymore. But luckily there was at least one published thing. So I recalibrated the date because the issue with the date was that it was really early, about 300 years earlier than it should be. I recalibrated the date using Caleb, and the date range is early kind of part of the late Moundville 2 stage, so around 270 Cal AD. And the date there, that late stage Moundville, particularly with some of these mounds, it can be a little earlier. So that's kind of expected there, but it gives a good sense of like kind of the temporal things, and then also trying to work with some of this legacy data too. But I'm not going to get into the radiocarbon mess here. So to kind of get a better sense of what's going on at the site at Snow's Bend, beyond just the legacy data, I figured I would talk about some of my geophysical research here. So this mound research I had done in collaboration with geophysicist Alon Plotner and Elliot Blair, who was my advisor. And you can see here that we were able to use a couple different methods and kind of integrate these to identify several construction stages for this mound. So this is a mound that was kind of implied that it was just built all in one go. People are leaving Moundville, let's build a new mound and build it quick. That's not the case here. So you can see that it was built in at least 2 stages, probably more when we calculate the the intensity of the signal that we're getting, further deep into the mound, it wasn't that great. And, for those of you who've done GPR with mounds, it's a little difficult to use the lower frequency antennas sometimes to get the basal layer of the mounds. And especially when you start dealing with stuff like clay lenses in the mounds, the signal from the GPR attenuates to a point where it's kind of difficult to get some of the more interior layers. So one thing I will point out here pretty quickly with the GPR data, just because I know there's a few of us who are familiar with that, this was done using an unshielded GPR, which is why it looks a little differently. But also for all of this stuff, we use some open source software to process everything here. So this is going to be in a forthcoming paper that I will talk about quite a bit, I'm sure, but this is kind of a sense of what's going on at the mound. So we're already going to get this more nuanced picture of life here at Snow's Bend. So I started conducting geophysical surveys in the village, briefly with the methods there beyond just the stuff at the mound, electrical resistance and magnetic radiometry here. 30 by 30 meters, 2.56 hectares, and it did not go quick because resistance, for those of you who have done it, takes quite a while sometimes, especially when you're doing 30 by 30. But one of the things I want to point out here with the survey design is that you're looking at this LiDAR model on the right. You can see that I organized these grids along this like elevated ridge. So when we think back to that photo of the flooding that's going on at Snow's Bend, I mean, you can kind of see what the long-term effects are pretty clearly here as you move into the rest of this field, and then also kind of see how this has kind of like carved these little streams into the peninsula over time. So I put this on the elevated ridge just because I did a few little test grids over in this area, and it was just nothing is coming up at all over there. And one of the other kinds of environmental issues here with doing geophysics, but also just kind of dealing with preserving the cultural heritage and trying to survey the site, is that there was a pretty large orchard in the middle of this area too, up until the 70s, that you can kind of tell in the resistance data where some of the root systems were. But so this survey here was designed to kind of integrate a lot of these issues with the legacy data to help kind of delineate the rest of the site beyond just the village. So, I got it into an area where it was going to be, the edge of the cemetery, if it was that far down, to the village, and then seeing how that connects to the mound. So seeing if it's just like a few different isolated sites or quite a, or one big site. So here you'll see the magnetic radiometry data. So I have the process stuff on the left, and then I used a method on the right. I followed Green and colleagues 2021. It was the American Antiquity paper for locating lost mounds to kind of automate the identification of certain positive and negative areas of magnetism at the site. So this basically just involved like simulating the removal of anything between plus and minus 2.5 nanoteslas, just because those related to a lot of the geological errors, as well underlying geology, but also operator and sensor error at the site. So with the stuff on the left, you can kind of see, there's quite a bit going on in the mag data. So it was pretty encouraging when you start looking at that. You start seeing a lot of different kinds of features of interest. So, you see it's stuff that is pretty clearly like metallic scatter up here. And then you start looking and you start finding all these kinds of dipolar features, as well as these kinds of pseudo monopoles. So, for those of you who deal with magnetic data, monopoles don't exist. They only exist in theory. So, kind of these are monopolar positive in that like the positive area is appearing as an isolated thing, but the limit of detection for the negative area surrounding it is pretty low. So it's not appearing. So, that'll also explain why I use a specific wording for some of the things here. So, pseudo monopoles, monopolar positive. A lot of this have used monopolar positive in our papers. So as I kind of like isolated each of these kinds of features to get a better sense of what's going on, we have this nice arrangement of metallic scatter throughout the site here. That's great. That's a historic site. There was a historic farm here, so that was particularly exciting for me. When we start doing geophysics, it's a palimpsest of all of these really cool kinds of features. So you got to be able to kind of distinguish between these things. So legacy data is important for kind of helping with that, but also, kind of have to expand the definition a little bit and think like a historian. Where's the maps? Where are the photos? What's the oral history of the area? So we can kind of help kind of untangle this really tangled landscape. So there's a historic tenant farm in this area, and as you can kind of see here, metallic scatter, which some of the metallic scatter right here, I can tell you exactly what it was. There was a hunting blind that was put there to look at the animals as they would come in. The family would go use it. I had stabbed enough of the tin roofing from when it was taken down with the resistance meter, but the rest of this stuff is pretty much in line with what I expected for the tenant farm. And then you start getting into these areas that are a little bit more difficult to interpret. You have this large area of non-metallic dipoles. These look, have signatures pretty similar to kinds of burnt daubed architecture. And then you start having a lot of these kinds of rectangular features throughout the site too that appear as like these pseudo monopoles. And, they have some signatures that are pretty much what you'd expect for clay kinds of daubed architecture that is not burnt, but it's pretty, dense concentration of it. So then, doing the electrical resistance data, using multiple geophysical methods is always important because it both will provide contrasting yet complementary views of the site that you're working at. So certain things will appear in resistance that won't appear in magnetic and vice versa. So one of the things I'll point out here too is that we have this nice linear high resistance feature. And I was talking about a tenant farm here. This is where the road was, and this actually overlaps really nicely with where the road should be coming through to go to those tenant farms. Then you start having these areas of really high resistance over here. And this is right where the orchard was too. So this is where it kind of starts getting a little difficult to interpret. And so one of the things, it's pretty clear when you start looking at the magnetic data. They have these nice dipole features right here that are organized around a semicircle. And in the magnetic data, those are really strong magnetic signatures for about 12 to 15 nanoteslas. So pretty similar to some burnt buildings that have been found before. And these are right next to the mound. So you see these actually correspond with an area of low resistance here too. So kind of, this is a crazy map. I fully acknowledge that. Kind of tracing and untangling these kinds of features to get a better sense of what's going on, I was able to kind of classify these to identify the potential Mississippian structures. And this is I found 3 neighborhoods in doing this to kind of help complement to the legacy data here. Found these 3 neighborhoods. And so this one is the North Village neighborhood. And this is characterized by quite a bit of these potential Mississippian structures, the metallic scatter here. And then you also have this area of low resistance here, and then it becomes kind of quiet as you start moving south. So it's just characterized by less frequent and intense, magnetic and resistive anomalies. And so kind of integrating the North Village neighborhood with the previous survey data, this is kind of what the greater picture is here. So, with the grog tempered ceramics right here, you can kind of see that these are kind of appearing in an area where there's some of the architecture. So with grog tempered, remember that's woodland. The architecture for the woodland period in this area is not something that I would expect to find in geophysical data, just because the nature of materials being used and kind of the intensity of some of those settlements. And then with the center, you see our shell tempered ceramics, and these correspond right where some of these potential Mississippian structures were. And, looking to the right, large concentrations of daub, remember, and look where some of the potential architecture is. So, kind of putting these potential structures right to where the center of these clusters are, probably not the best idea, but if you kind of see that the close correlation here to where these are appearing is pretty interesting too. And with this one cluster right here appearing right where this like kind of linear scatter of dipoles are, that's an area that's particularly of interest for potential future research there. So, let's talk really quick about the other neighborhoods here. We have the South Village neighborhood, and you can kind of see where these anomalies are lining up here. You also have this nice linear burnt feature, which, you can interpret it as a potential screen or palisade kind of wall. And, thinking through how this kind of stuff tracks across the site. Remember, this is just a little sliver of the site. And if we think about, okay, you have this nice little sliver of the site on this high area, you have this area that's pretty flooded and eroded pretty often. Then you have the rest of this area kind of extending off into the woods. This is just only a portion of what Snows Bend really is. You gotta start thinking about what are these like kind of key things that make Mississippian towns here, especially, as we start pulling from legacy data to kind of interpret these things. There's got to be a plaza somewhere. There's got to be a lot more stuff going on somewhere. And, that's just one of the things that kind of make doing some of this research a little complicated, but that's a discussion for another day. So, beyond the geophysical data, I talked a lot about some dealing with the legacy data, dealing with some of the issues with the legacy data, locating sites, but also just kind of delineating some of these sites. So, I will say, I was trained in historic preservation, and I came into this field through museum education and historic preservation. So, when I'm thinking about dealing with some of these things, my immediate gut response is, oh, let's just go talk to landowners. Let's do some oral histories, and let's start pulling some land records and start trying to see what's going on here. Usually I think about that in terms of the built environment, but talking with the landowners, they had a really good knowledge of general features of the farm. Families owned the farm for quite a very long time. So they've been pretty keenly aware with the state of the mound, the location of the village, and they've never really grew any crops in that area because they tried to once, and they kept bringing up a bunch of pottery, so they stopped. So dealing with some of the archaeological legacy data beyond, thinking about their oral histories, it's a little bit more complicated. You're missing a lot more than you have. So it's really difficult to actually assess these impacts. So having these conversations with landowners, they're like, hey, what's really going on out here? Pulling from a lot of different sources, you can kind of answer those questions. But geophysics in this case, it's great. It can help, but that's not accessible for them. Not all of us can just go pull out a resistance meter and go survey a farm. So, one of the things I was kind of hoping we could discuss a little bit here is, how do we kind of pull other sources of information in consistent ways so that we can kind of facilitate some of these kinds of conversations with landowners, but also do so in a way that's pretty comparative for us kind of working with each other across the Southeast and, the US. Because, one of the things that I kind of struggle with too is, this was never supposed to be the intent of the research. It was more about placemaking and all this other stuff. But, it was kind of hard to avoid dealing with the environmental impacts of the site because they're quite large. Flooding is a pretty big issue out there. And with the rate of loss that's going on there, it's pretty significant. And one thing before we kind of start talking, one thing that I will point out here is that I tried to do endpoint rate calculations for the kind of changing, to model the erosion that's going on in the riverbanks, but these rivers are changing constantly over time. For those of you who are familiar with like how fluvial geomorphology works, that might be not the best way to kind of go about talking about erosion at these sites. So anyways, just as a brief acknowledgements to the research at Snows Bend, I've had a lot of help from a lot of great undergraduate and graduate students and colleagues from multiple institutions for getting equipment and just conducting the field work. And I know quite a few, I was able to do this and provide some kind of field school opportunity so that this was all done during COVID. So, doing a master's research project during a pandemic is not the best time in the world. So, there's a lot of people to thank.